In this video, I'm going to explore the topic regarding the Trump assassination and his surviving that assassination in terms of whether God did it. Did God do it? That is the subject of this video. And the purpose of this video is not to endorse any political candidate. It's not even really about the current race, presidential race. What it's about is a philosophical inquiry into whether or not God has a stake in any leader or political system of government, and whether or not God chooses to intervene in the state of affairs in the world and chooses to put God's finger on the scale of in terms of who is going to win a particular contest in any particular moment in history, in order to shape the events or in order to shape the trajectory of human events and world history? Or does God simply step back and just let, free will take its course? Does God's respect for free will and free agency allow literally anything to happen? Or does God selectively and strategically choose to intervene in world history at particular times and places in order to promote an outcome that is more consistent with God's vision for the world? So, for instance, we could go back to the Emperor Constantine and the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. And he was fighting to consolidate at that time at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the western half of the empire. And he had a vision of a cross in the sky. And also Christ, according to this vision, spoke to the Emperor Constantine. Well, he was a general on the battlefield at the time, and told him, "In this sign ye shall conquer." So Christ, or the Emperor Constantine, ordered the Christogram, the Greek letters Chi-Rho, which means it's a Christogram. It's an image of Christ on the shields of his soldiers, and they had an overwhelming, decisive victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, which allowed the Emperor Constantine to consolidate his power over the entire western half of the Roman Empire. And then 12 years later, he consolidated and took over the eastern half of the empire. So that is one precedent we have from history where God ostensibly intervened in world events to ensure an outcome consistent with God's desire for the world. So then, obviously, after Constantine, the Emperor Constantine consolidated rule, he was very sympathetic to Christianity from then on out. Now, he was a little conflicted, but, in the end, Christianity became from being an oppressed religion to being a preferred religion under the Emperor Constantine. So the argument there is that by God intervening at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and installing a ruler that was more conducive to the Christian God and that God's worldview, that therefore divine intervention is something that happens. And there are many cases in the Bible, for example, in the Old Testament and Moses and the freeing of the Jews from some bondage in Egypt. And there are many other cases throughout time. Another example would be a more contemporary example. Well, not contemporary, but more contemporary than the Emperor Constantine in 312 would be the storm of 1588. And we might know from English history that the Spanish were going to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. And they had this armada that was going to invade England and overthrow Protestant rule and bring back Catholic rule into Great Britain, England. And they were going to dispose of Queen Elizabeth I and install Mary Queen of Scots, who was Catholic. And then they were also going to torture and maim the people of England who were Protestant to force them back into Catholicism. But there was a freak storm of 1588, which essentially destroyed the Spanish Armada and neutralized that threat. And that sustained Queen Elizabeth. And she gave a very powerful speech at Tilbury when she was leading her army she was facing that invasion. So we could say that everything is purely coincidence, that, things like the Emperor Constantine's vision and, his decisive victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. We could say, that was just a coincidence or maybe hallucination. We could also say that the storm that destroyed the Spanish Armada in 1588 was just a coincidence, that there was nothing to it, that it was just a coincidence that happened. Or we could look at it through a different lens and a different interpretive framework, and we could say, no, this was actually divine intervention. So, what is the sort of precedent we have for divine intervention? Well, Thomas Hobbes in 1651 wrote the Leviathan, a book on political philosophy. And according to Thomas Hobbes, 1651, he articulates the purpose of miracles. And, quote, he says, "The nature of a miracle is that it be wrought for the procuring of credit to God's messengers, ministers, and prophets, that thereby men may know that they are called, sent, and employed by God, and thereby be the better inclined to obey them." End quote. So what is Thomas Hobbes saying here? What Thomas Hobbes is saying is that the reason why God performs miracles, he does so to ordain rulers, and that the people know unambiguously that that ruler is ordained by God. And so, for example, Queen Elizabeth I, the argument there is that the storm of 1588 was sent by God to preserve her reign. It's not to say that Protestant Christianity was any better than Catholic Christianity necessarily, but that her style of Christianity and her as a ruler was more just and more in line with the ethos of the one true God, and therefore God intervened on her behalf. And so there's sort of a tension, sort of a dialectical tension between sort of free will and the plan that God has for the world. And so, on the one hand, in respect for free will, God will allow tremendous things to happen, even sometimes atrocities or horrible things. Those are not ordained by God, but God allows that because of God's respect for free will. On the other hand, there is the world that God wants to manifest according to God's will, which is often contrary to the free will actions of creatures. So therefore, there are times, particular places and times in history, that God chooses to intervene in ways that override the free will actions of creatures. So basically, God will trump, if you will, the creaturely freedom of individuals. So in the case of the storm of 1588, the King of Spain wanted to invade England. That was his free will and you could argue, his sovereign right to do that. But then God intervened in a way that didn't allow that to happen, and thus sustaining Queen Elizabeth. So there are examples throughout history of these types of things happening. Now, we could all say, again, it's all random. There's no meaning to any of it. But the other argument would be, if there is a God, and that God is intelligent, and that God has a plan for humanity, and that God created humans with a purpose, and created societies with an intention and a purpose in accordance with God's will, that God would then intervene in various ways, divine intervention, metaphysical things happening that go outside of the laws of nature in many cases, to ensure a particular outcome. There's also a professor from Oxford in 2015. His name is Benedict Goki, and he wrote about the metaphysics of divine intervention, and in fact, authored a paper entitled Did God Do It? And this is a quote from Goki, 2015, quote, metaphysical model of special divine intervention as revealed in the Christian Holy Bible as follows, quote, that God acts in the world on special occasions in order to guarantee the success of his providential plans in such a way that counterfactually, had God not acted, then the course of nature would have been different. A special act of divine intervention thus is God's actualization of a state of affairs that otherwise would not have occurred, end quote. So basically what Goki is saying here is that if God hadn't acted, the outcome wouldn't have been such that it was. And then he goes on to describe things like the Red Sea parting, and that if God chooses to act on molecules in such a way that they act and that they temporarily suspend the normal laws of nature, in this case, in the case of the Bible, the parting of the Red Sea, such that would allow God's will to be done and would allow, in that case, the Jews to walk through, then that's a scientific explanation that Goki is presenting, that sometimes God may choose to go around the normal laws of nature and act on particles and atoms and molecules in such a way to ensure his plan or intention for the world is carried out in accordance with his will. We also would call that a miracle. Things that don't happen in the normal course of events. So, getting to the main point of this video, what about President Trump and the notion that divine intervention might have had a role to play, for example, on the assassination attempt on 13 July 2024. So what are the odds that that bullet would have grazed him in such a way that wouldn't have caused any actual damage to him, but was enough to show that he was impacted by the bullet? Could it be that this is God's way of showing God's power in such an instance? What are the odds, statistically speaking, that that bullet would have grazed him in such a way to do absolutely no mortal damage whatsoever, but show that he was hit, but yet in a way that might be a message from God showing that this was divine intervention that saved him? Or you could say this was all just in the realm of statistical probability, and it was just a 1 in a billion chance that it would have happened that way. This is, again, getting to interpretive framework. But for example, in the Gospels, there's a case where there was a blind man healed by Jesus Christ, and the disciples of Jesus said, Master, why was this man blind? Was it him or his parents that sinned? And Jesus said, neither did this man sin, nor did his parents sin, but that the power of God be made manifest in this miracle. So what Jesus was saying is that this man didn't sin, his parents didn't sin. He was blind only because God wanted to show his power in healing that man who was blind from birth. So there are cases where God could be intervening simply to show a demonstration of God's own power, but also combined with putting God's finger on the scale to preserve particular leaders, whether it's the Emperor Constantine in 312, whether it's Elizabeth I in 1588, or whether it's Trump in 2024. God could be acting in a way to preserve a particular person, to preserve them to become the leader of a nation for a particular outcome that is in line with God's will. Now, I'm not saying this is the case. I'm saying look at the evidence and make up your own mind as to whether you think divine intervention is possible, one, and two, if God might have acted in this case to preserve Trump for whatever reason God has in mind. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I just wanted to put this out there for everyone philosophically to look at this type of phenomenon, not just in this case, but also in any case. Would God intervene in the world in ways to tip the scale and to change world events in such a way to preserve God's providential plan for the world and to keep the world on track in accordance with his will? I look forward to your comments. Please like and subscribe and share with a friend. And I look forward to your comments, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.